For 40 years, the St. Leopold Psychiatric Institute remained abandoned. Rusted doors, empty hallways, broken windows. Nothing but silence. Until in recent weeks, something started happening exactly at 3:11 a.m. Shadows crossing windows that shouldn't have any light. 15 bodies of unknown individuals found on old stretchers, each one wearing admission wristbands with the names of people who died decades ago. And on the walls, a phrase written in red paint: "No one discharged me." Today you're going to discover what happens when a hospital refuses to forget, and when someone refuses to be forgotten. Part 1. Dawn in Buffalo always carries a cold that seems to come from somewhere deeper than the weather. A kind of suspended, silent humidity that seeps into old buildings and into the bones of abandoned structures. But that morning, the wind dragged something different. It wasn't just the typical late winter fog. It was a dense, unmoving unease that seemed to gather around the dark silhouette of the old St. Leopold Psychiatric Institute, closed for more than 40 years. The police entered the building shortly before 5:30 a.m., after a city maintenance worker reported seeing from the street a light turn on in a wing that hadn't had power in decades. He described the illumination as a faint yellowish glow, like an old hospital lamp trying to work after being dead. When the first teams arrived, they noticed that the side doors, officially sealed, were now only pushed closed, as if someone had passed through with absolute care not to make any noise. The smell inside the building wasn't the typical odor of mold and rust. There was something more structured, almost chemical, like remnants of a clinical environment that, even in ruins, still tried to maintain an identity. The hallways were as they had always been since the shutdown. Accumulated dust, peeling walls, exposed concrete, broken windows. But something had changed. An arrangement, an organization, a purpose. The first stretcher appeared in corridor 3B, one of those old ones with rusted sides, locked wheels, and a thin, yellowed mattress. On it lay the body of a man around 50 years old, later identified as a local homeless man. The body was carefully positioned. There were no signs of struggle. The head rested on a worn pillow, as if someone had made an effort to leave him comfortable for some kind of procedure. On his wrist, an admission wristband, but not just any wristband. It was an old model, the type used in the 60s and 70s, made of rigid plastic with faded typography. The recorded name didn't match the victim's. It was the name of a patient who had died inside that hospital in 1978. Before any interpretation could form, the officers found a second stretcher, then a third, then a fourth, all occupied by people who, according to initial reports, lived on the streets of Buffalo. On each one, an old wristband, each with names belonging to different patients, all with nebulous histories, all with medical files abruptly closed when the hospital was shut down. External security cameras were analyzed still before dawn. The footage showed, always around 3:11 a.m., shadows crossing the windows of the abandoned building. Precise movements, continuous, without hesitation, as if the person, or people, moving inside, knew every corner of the place. When the video analysis department increased the exposure of the recordings, something caught their attention. A full figure was never visible, only fragments of movement, an arm passing by, the projection of a torso. Always silent, always at the same window, always at the same time. On the floor of the West Psychiatric Wing, where the most severe patients were kept during the hospital's operational years, a phrase appeared written in red paint, dripping, irregular, but still legible. "No one discharged me." The phrase repeated on other walls, always with small variations in handwriting, but maintaining an obsessive pattern. In the occupational therapy wing, "Someone needs to finish what wasn't done." In the old cafeteria, "The file is not an end, it's a promise." The forensic team found marks on the floor indicating that the stretchers had been dragged from the rooms to the hallways. There were no signs of blood, physical violence, or visible injuries on the victims. However, preliminary analyses indicated sedation, a relatively clean, precise sedation as if performed with method. There were no traces of substances typically used on the street. On the contrary, It seemed like an old hospital compound, the kind used in psychiatric units for chemical restraint of patients in crisis. As the officers walked through the hallways, they noticed a detail that would repeat as a pattern. Each body was positioned in front of a specific room door, and each of these rooms corresponded to the number associated with the patient whose name was on the wristband placed on the victim. In other words, someone was reconstructing old hospital admissions, replacing the original people with new ones, as if they were updating files. In the old record storage room, a partially broken, rusted door revealed the most disturbing sight of the scene. Hundreds of the hospital's original folders were spread on the floor in circles, organized with geometric precision. In the center, a single open notebook, its cover darkened by time. The pages filled with recent notes written in anxious, obsessive handwriting. Phrases repeated dozens of times. The file never closes. The name doesn't die. The discharge is a lie. And finally, I'm only fixing what you left behind. The total number of bodies identified that morning reached 15, all positioned according to some symbolic pattern that still made no sense to the local police. But one thing was undeniable. This wasn't just a sequence of murders. It was an administrative ritual, a bureaucratic procedure turned into a mechanism of death. The hospital felt alive, not because of a supernatural entity, but because of something more unsettling. A collapsing mind that had found, in the building's abandonment, the perfect setting to reenact institutional trauma. As if someone believed they were simply doing their job, a job no one had ever finished. The atmosphere inside St. Leopold grew heavier with every step. Officers commented that in certain parts of the hallway, they could feel the air turn colder, more condensed, almost as if the space had been holding onto a memory for decades, and it was finally able to breathe again. And when the police department realized the scale of the case, 15 deaths, psychiatric symbolism, reconstructed old records, ritualistic phrases, and the sense that this was far from over, only one unit seemed capable of deciphering what was truly happening there. The MINDTRACE Division. Part 2. The official call reached the MINDTRACE Division shortly before 7 a.m. There was no emergency alert, no tone of panic, no dramatic language, just the kind of message the team recognized from afar, when authorities didn't know what they were looking at and, for that reason, asked for help. The digital document attached to the request contained 3 elements. 1. A brief report about 15 deaths inside an abandoned hospital structure. 2. 2 blurred photos, one of a rusted stretcher with an old admission wristband on the victim's wrist, another of the phrase, "No one discharged me," written in red paint. 3. A final note from the Buffalo police. Behavioral pattern suggests deliberate reconstruction. We need advanced cognitive analysis. The message was clear. This wasn't just about identifying a killer. It was about understanding an entire mental system. Supervisor Dr. Liz Murray reviewed the material the moment she arrived at the strategy room. She didn't react with shock. That wasn't her role. Her expression remained neutral, but there was a depth in her eyes that appeared whenever institutional trauma surfaced as the central motivation for a crime. She knew that old mental health facilities carried buried stories, distorted memories, undocumented wounds, and that these places, when reactivated by a vulnerable mind, could generate crimes with their own internal logic, hermetic, symbolic, requiring decoding. Beside her, Jay Carter, a neurobehavioral specialist, analyzed the amplified images. He observed patterns most people wouldn't notice: positioning of the stretchers, direction of the victim's feet, equidistances, spatial repetition, coherence between locations and dates in the old medical files. Jay didn't see crime scenes. He saw externalized mental structures. For him, the hospital was a cognitive map. Every hallway, every phrase written on the wall, every old wristband was a fragment of thought turned physically into environment. Meanwhile, Mark Henderson, an expert in symbolic reconstruction, studied the report in silent focus. He fixated on the phrase, "old medical records associated with contemporary victims." For Mark, symbols weren't just messages, they were mechanisms of emotional compensation. The fact that someone was replacing dead identities with living bodies suggested a deep level of collapse between past and present. And that pointed to a mind no longer distinguishing between what was and what needed to be again. The team gathered around the digital table. The three-dimensional file of St. Leopold was projected into the air, a cold, fragmented silhouette showing entire blocked-off wings, long corridors like dark tunnels, and hospital blocks arranged in a grid layout typical of psychiatric institutions from the 1960s. The preliminary forensic report from Buffalo Police indicated 15 victims, none with any known connection to each other, all socially invisible, with no recent medical records, no close family, all previously sedated with compounds no longer used since the 1980s. Original St. Leopold wristbands, impossible to obtain without internal access to the old archive. Victim positioning identical to what appeared in the deactivated medical files. For MINDTRACE, this said a lot. The team's first inference was simple but crucial. The killer wasn't acting impulsively. He was executing a process, a ritualistically administrative process. A job he believed was still part of some structure, as if he were completing tasks left unfinished when the hospital closed. Dr. Liz drew attention to a detail, the phrase, "No one discharged me." In clinical interpretation, this wasn't just an emotional statement, it was a coded confession of psychological imprisonment. People who spent long periods in traditional institutions often describe the feeling that they never truly left. Abrupt deinstitutionalization, when done without support, left administrative ghosts in the minds of former patients and neglected employees. Jay, analyzing the pattern of shadows seen in the cameras, suggested that the killer had full command of the building. Constant movements, precise, always at the same time. That indicated routine, and beyond that, it indicated memory. This wasn't someone exploring a location, it was someone returning to their professional habitat. Mark, in turn, highlighted the symbolism of the wristbands. In the hospital world, a wristband represents clinical identity, the administrative link between person and institution. Replacing them with the names of patients who died decades earlier was, symbolically, an act of resurrecting a file and trying to correct history. A clear sign that the killer possessed some kind of documentary integrity disorder, an obsessive fixation on records, categories, medical files, admission and discharge certifications. For the team, the behavioral equation began to form: someone who worked inside the hospital, someone with physical or symbolic access to the old records, someone with deep institutional trauma, someone who believes past deaths were not properly closed, someone trying to close them now. The presence of the phrases written on the walls raised a second point of analysis. They weren't random. There was a pattern of bureaucratic complaint mixed with suffering. They weren't threats. They weren't confessions. They were archival grievances, as if the person were demanding explanations from a system that no longer existed. Phrases typically associated with individuals who internalize extinct institutional roles. The team also noted that all victims had been chosen among people invisible to society. For Liz, this was a clear psychological strategy. To the killer, these people were equivalent to the forgotten patients of the past. They were replaceable within the logic of the ritual. He didn't see them as individuals, but as administrative gaps waiting to be filled. When the final police report arrived, the closing sentence caught the entire MINDTRACE team's attention. This hospital appears to have been reactivated by a single mind. Jay tilted his head as he read it. It wasn't a metaphor, it was exactly what they were seeing. The symbolic reactivation of an entire institution, not by ghosts, not by inexplicable phenomena, but by an individual who had turned the building into the physical expansion of their own psychosis. At the end of the briefing, the decision was inevitable. The MINDTRACE Division would need to enter St. Leopold not only as investigators, but as observers of a materialized cognitive state. They weren't entering a typical crime scene. They were entering an abandoned mental archive, an archive someone was desperate to reorganize, an archive that never received discharge. Part 3. When the MINDTRACE Division arrived in Buffalo, the deactivated hospital had already been secured. Safety lines surrounded the main entrance, but the building remained imposing, silent, almost indifferent to the movement outside. To the team, that abandoned architecture wasn't just the setting of a crime. It was a mind frozen in time, and every brick held a different layer of the killer's psychological collapse. As soon as they crossed the containment line, the initial analysis began. MINDTRACE didn't only observe what was present, they also observed what was missing. The absent patterns, the silences, the deviations, the repetitions that spoke louder than concrete evidence. The first realization was structural. The way the victims were distributed was not random. The stretchers occupied specific points of the hospital, creating an almost ceremonial alignment between wings that originally had distinct functions. Jay Carter walked slowly through the west corridor, noting distances and repeating the gesture of visually measuring the position of each body. To him, the scene formed a diagram, and a diagram reveals a mind-seeking order. In the case of St. Leopold, that order seemed to reproduce the original inpatient layout. The team concluded that the killer wasn't just staging deaths, he was reconstructing old routines he had likely witnessed closely for many years. 1. The logic of retroactive admission. Dr. Liz Murray pointed out a recurring pattern in the descriptions. All victims showed signs of prior sedation, but without violence, without physical restraint, without marks of resistance. This indicated that the killer had experience approaching vulnerable individuals in a non-threatening way. He might have offered help, food, a promise of shelter, something that would activate trust in someone socially invisible. For Liz, this pointed to a specific type of delusion, the administrative protective delusion. In this category, the offender does not perceive themselves as an agent of violence. They perceive themselves as someone who is caring, organizing, performing a necessary procedure. Death, therefore, is not interpreted as homicide, but as an inevitable bureaucratic endpoint. The fact that each victim received the name of a patient from the past reinforced this hypothesis. The killer believed he was correcting old institutional failures, as if the deaths of the past hadn't been properly concluded, as if the system had left loose ends. He wasn't creating a new cycle. He was trying to close an old one, which to him had remained open for decades. 2. The phrase, "No one discharged me." Among all the messages left in the hospital, this one sparked the deepest analysis. To the general public, it might seem like a mere outburst, something symbolic. But to MINDTRACE, it carried a specific technical weight. For Liz, the phrase was a classic marker of traumatic institutionalization. People subjected to long periods of psychiatric hospitalization, especially in the 60s and 70s, often internalized the feeling that their identity was tied to the building. Discharge was more than a medical order. It was a kind of license to exist outside. When that discharge never came, or came abruptly, the brain registered the absence as abandonment. Was it possible that the killer had been a patient there himself? Yes. But the team perceived more. The phrasing resembled the hospital's bureaucratic language, not a patient's emotional language. This mattered. It meant that if there was trauma, it likely came from a staff position. Someone who had seen the backstage, the negligence, the disregard, the accumulation of files, the bureaucratic silence that devours those who don't fit. 3. The ritual as a form of compensation. Mark Henderson was examining the old file storage room when he identified a subtle detail. Many folders were open exactly on the daily conduct sections, those where nurses recorded observations about the patient's mental state. The original pages were worn, but someone had rewritten entire sections in recent handwriting, repeated phrases, circled, underlined. Mark interpreted this as an attempt to rewrite the clinical history of the people. Not the ones who were now dead, but the patients of the past. This suggested a deep dissociation between identity, time, and function. The killer seemed to believe he was restoring a form of institutional order that should never have been interrupted. Jay made a technical comment during the analysis. Whoever did this doesn't see death, they see regularization. That sentence became one of the keys to the investigation. The offender reconstructed the past as though conducting an audit. Bodies were physical files. Stretchers were shelving units. Corridors were filing drawers. The entire hospital had become a giant cabinet of obsessions. 4. The shadows in the windows, spatial cognitive pattern. Upon reviewing the security footage, the team noticed something the police hadn't. The sequence of shadows had rhythm. This wasn't just someone walking from one room to another. There was methodical movement. Same time, 3:11 a.m., same corridor, same route, same interruption pattern. To Jay, this revealed a form of ritualistic repetition. People with chronic psychotic disorders tend to establish rigid routines that create a sense of normality. The fact that the killer appeared at the same time every night suggested that he was repeating a procedure that, in his mind, was part of an old shift, possibly a schedule he used to work. To Liz, this wasn't just repetitive behavior. It was active traumatic memory. The killer was likely reenacting exactly what he did decades earlier, when he walked through the wings checking charts, confirming names, verifying patients. She said, "He's not imitating what he used to do. He still believes he is doing it." That is the difference between symbolic ritual and psychotic ritual. 5. The sedation, clinical signature. The fact that all victims showed standardized sedation suggested that the killer had practical knowledge of chemical restraint. This wasn't someone improvising, and it wasn't someone with access to modern medications. The detected substances were old, chemical, scarcely used today. This reinforced the hypothesis that the offender had access to old stocks or knew exactly how to manipulate obsolete compounds. This skill aligned with two groups: nurses, clinical archivists with hybrid training, occupational therapy or restraint staff. Of all possible profiles, the most likely was that of a nurse archivist, someone who moved between wings and file rooms, someone who knew patients and documents with equal intimacy, someone whose professional identity was shattered when the hospital closed. 6. The mind behind the ritual. After hours of initial analysis, the team reached a first behavioral conclusion. The killer did not see the victims as strangers. He saw them as administrative substitutes. He believed he was returning lost identities, regularizing pending issues, reconstructing interrupted files, and more. The choice of homeless individuals was symbolic. People without formal records, without social footprints, fit perfectly within the mental process he would call patients without discharge. MINDTRACE knew this killer is not motivated by anger, but by mission. A psychotic, distorted, bureaucratic mission, but a mission. And this type of offender only stops when he believes he has finally completed all the files, which means he hasn't completed them yet. Not even close. Part 4. When the MINDTRACE Division entered St. Leopold for the definitive step-by-step reconstruction, the environment already felt like more than an old building. It was like walking through a dead organism that, somehow, still breathed through someone's memory. Dust rose in slow waves, scattered by the flashlight beams revealing particles that seemed suspended for decades, waiting for witnesses capable of understanding them. The reconstruction didn't consist only of mapping the scenes, but of tracking the mind that assembled them. What the team needed to answer was simple in form, yet profound in essence. How did the killer transform the hospital into an extension of his bureaucratic delusion? The answer would come from details that, at first glance, seemed random, but which to MINDTRACE formed an internal narrative. 1. The entrance, the first point of contact. The hospital's side door, once sealed, now showed signs of careful handling. No marks of forced entry, no structural damage. The team concluded that the killer likely possessed old keys, common among staff of the time, especially those connected to the archives sector or the night nursing routines. The initial corridor showed marks from stretcher wheels on the floor. They weren't new marks, they were recent within the context of the building's abandonment. Mark Henderson analyzed the direction of the marks. They came from a secondary wing that wasn't part of the main route during the hospital's operational years. This indicated something important. The killer wasn't using the original pathways, but rather the backstage paths. internal passages used by staff to avoid the main corridors when transporting files, supplies, or unstable patients. This suggested intact operational memory. This suggested someone who had truly worked there. 2. Victim capture. The approach pattern. The team assembled a timeline. Based on detected sedation and disappearance reports around Buffalo, the killer seemed to act between 12:30 a.m. and 2:00 a.m. when homeless individuals walked through the colder areas looking for shelter. According to Liz, the approach likely followed a gentle script, an offer of help, the promise of a place to sleep, comforting language simulating care, complete absence of threat. For MINDTRACE, this revealed a complex cognitive pattern. The killer didn't see himself as a captor, but as an admissions officer. The person wasn't kidnapped, they were admitted. And this explained the lack of resistance, the initial relaxation found in the victim's muscles, and the use of mild sedatives consistent with old psychiatric practices. The sedation likely occurred inside the hospital, after entry. Reconstruction showed minimal scratches on the metal of an old auxiliary table. Signs of a vial opened quickly, but not clumsily. Someone accustomed to the gesture. 3. Internal movement, the positioning ritual. The team followed the route the killer likely used to bring the sedated victims to the selected stretchers. The route wasn't the shortest, it was the most symbolic. The killer walked each body through the corridors where, decades earlier, real patients had been transported. It was as if he were reenacting old shifts, walking routes taken from memory. Jay noted an important detail. The estimated time between each death was nearly identical. A regularity of roughly 1 hour and 28 minutes, suggesting not just method, but schedule. The killer seemed to follow an administrative ritual that only made sense inside his psychosis. Admission, registration, placement, finalization. The team recreated the path using their own steps, trying to understand the time required to cross the hospital carrying a body. Everything aligned with disturbing precision. He wasn't improvising. He was following routines he had internalized decades earlier. 4. The choice of stretchers, an internal classification system. The team examined all 15 stretchers used. Although they looked identical to the police, MINDTRACE found clear differences. Some belonged to the chemical restraint wing, others to the observation wing, others to the occupational therapy wing. These differences were nearly invisible, noticeable only to someone who had worked there for years. The stretchers were chosen not by availability, but by original function. And each victim was placed on the stretcher corresponding to the type of care the original patient, decades earlier, should have received. For Mark, this was crucial. Someone was trying to correct old files that, in his view, had been irresponsibly filled out. The wristbands were the final confirmation. Each name corresponded to a patient whose hospital stay had been closed without detailed description. The killer was therefore filling in gaps. 5. The records room, the heart of the delusion. The circular archive found on the floor could only be interpreted one way, a mind attempting to reorganize a collapsed documentary universe. MINDTRACE reconstructed the spatial logic used by the killer. Mark identified 3 circles. Outer circle, files of patients with incomplete history. Intermediate circle, patients with questionable deaths. Inner circle, patients who never received formal discharge. In the center, the notebook with obsessive phrases. The team reached the following conclusion. The killer was mentally reconstructing the hierarchy of abandonment he had witnessed in the hospital. The scattered files represented the bureaucratic chaos he believed he was responsible for fixing, even 40 years later. It was a ritual of documentary purification, and the bodies were the corrected documents. 6. The repeated phrase on the walls, the cognitive signature. While reconstructing each writing pattern, Jay identified micro-variations in handwriting that indicated different emotional states at the time of writing, sometimes anger, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes almost cold lucidity. To the team, this didn't indicate multiple authors. It indicated one thing: symptomatic fluctuation of schizoaffective disorder. moments of clarity and moments of deep delusion coexisting. A fragmented mind trying to complete something that was never finished. Liz interpreted the phrase, "No one discharged me," not just as memory, but as accusation. Not against patients, not against victims, but against doctors, administrators, directors, authority figures who neglected lives. The killer wasn't avenging patients. He was demanding administrative accountability from the past, and the victims were tools, not targets. 7. The time 3:11 a.m. When the team cross-referenced old hospital routine records, they found a surprising detail. At 3:10 a.m. during the 60s and 70s, the night verification shift began, when nurses walked through every wing noting conditions, restraint statuses, and clinical changes. 3:11 wasn't just any time. It was an institutional time. This confirmed, the killer was reliving a shift lost in time. He wasn't just killing, he was working. In his mind, he was still employed, still responsible for completing abandoned tasks, still responding to orders no one else remembered. 8. Reconstruction conclusion. After 6 hours of continuous reconstruction, MINDTRACE synthesized the complete scene. The killer walks through the hospital as if returning to his old job. He approaches vulnerable people as if admitting new patients. He sedates as if applying outdated protocols. He positions bodies as if correcting decades-old errors. He writes on walls as if demanding a discharge he never received. Everything in St. Leopold, every phrase, every moved object, every schedule, every displacement, was the physical manifestation of a mental system bureaucratized by pain. The team now knew. They weren't facing just a killer. They were facing a former employee who never left the hospital, mentally, institutionally, existentially. A man trapped in the eternal shift of a dawn in 1978. Part 5. The development of the killer's psychological profile marked the turning point of the investigation. Until that moment, MINDTRACE had reconstructed scenes, interpreted patterns, and decoded external behaviors. Now, it was time to enter the core of what sustained the entire logic of death at St. Leopold. Not a classic motive, but an internal structure, a closed, bureaucratic, ritualistic mental world. When the team began integrating the data, something became clear. The killer did not operate under common emotional motivation. He operated under institutionalized motivation. He didn't want to kill people. He wanted to finalize processes. And this indicated, above all, fragmented professional identity, persistent traumatic memory, and functional delusion. 1. The predominant psychological type. Permanent employee of the dead institution. MINDTRACE classified the killer within a rare subtype of psychotic collapse known as dissociative institutional permanence syndrome. In this condition, the individual maintains an absolute psychological bond with an institution that once formed a fundamental part of their identity. When that institution disappears, whether hospital, barracks, school, factory, the mind does not absorb the closure. It preserves functions, routines, duties. In the case of St. Leopold, the abrupt shutdown of the hospital in the 1980s didn't represent just the loss of a job. It represented the collapse of a mental structure that sustained a vulnerable individual. This explains why the killer behaves with the precision of an employee on duty, not with the impulsivity typical of impulsive or vengeful criminals. He is not repeating traumatic memories chaotically. He is executing tasks he believes are still mandatory. 2. The primary disorder. Schizoaffective disorder with administrative delusion. The behavioral patterns observed indicated a deeply consolidated schizoaffective condition. Symptoms included functional theme delusions, belief that he still holds his old job, internalized voices in the form of institutional commands, not external voices, memories transformed into orders, blunted affect but channeled into ritualistic care, gentle handling of victims, temporal consciousness lapses, mixing past decades with the present, compulsive symbolic construction, phrases, reorganized files, repeated schedules. This type of disorder typically emerges in people who spent long periods in environments with rigid hierarchy, suffered psychological abuse from authority figures, had their identity shaped by repetitive rules and protocols, never developed full emotional autonomy outside that place. For Liz, the most significant pathology wasn't the psychosis itself, but the fusion between trauma and function. The killer did not live as an individual, he lived as a role. 3. The origin trauma, administrative negligence and witnessed dehumanization. When reviewing historical documents about St. Leopold, MINDTRACE confirmed the hypothesis looming from the start. The hospital had a severe history of negligence, overcrowding, and administrative abuse. For decades, patients were forgotten in remote wings. Files accumulated in piles without updates. Deaths were recorded with a few lines, without investigation, without adequate description. For a sensitive, observant, emotionally vulnerable archivist nurse, witnessing all this for years could generate two possible reactions: emotional rupture and abandonment of the role, or obsessive hyperfixation on the need to correct bureaucratic injustice. The killer clearly lived the second. He didn't just see failures, he internalized those failures as personal responsibility. He didn't just observe forgotten patients, he absorbed their pain as part of his job. He didn't just witness incomplete files, he assumed he needed to complete them, even if 40 years later. His trauma wasn't with blood, pain, or physical violence. It was with institutional forgetting. 4. The victims. Nameless patients. In the killer's perception, the victim's selection was not random but deeply symbolic. MINDTRACE identified 4 shared characteristics among the 15 dead. 1. Social invisibility. 2. Lack of family ties. 3. History of emotional fragility or substance dependence. 4. Absence of recent records in hospital systems. To a psychotic archivist, this group would appear as the perfect reproduction of the forgotten patients of the past. People the system ignored, neglected, or lost among numbers. People who had no discharge because they never had proper admission. Thus, the killer didn't choose victims. He filled administrative gaps with available bodies, believing he was correcting historical failures. This is the essence of the ritual, not violence, but regularization. 5. The wristbands, transplanted administrative identity. The most revealing object of all, each old plastic wristband bearing the name of a patient who died decades earlier, represented the symbolic core of the disorder. To the killer, identity is not defined by the person, but by the file. Who carries the name is irrelevant. Who wears the wristband continues the process. Placing wristbands on the dead was, for him, a ceremony of institutional continuity, as if he were reactivating a patient who had been interrupted, reconnecting a bureaucratic circuit forcibly shut down in 1978. And each death in his mind was not death. It was case closure. It was the final signature on documents never completed. 6. The writing on the walls, externalization of collapse. The phrase "no one discharged me" is the emotional core of the delusion. For someone who worked years in an oppressive environment where everything was recorded, where every life was a number, every consultation a stamp, every death a cold line of ink, that phrase means abandonment, emotional imprisonment, lack of closure, inability to move forward, feeling eternally bound to the institution that destroyed him. But at the same time, it also means accusation. Not toward patients, but toward doctors and administrators he saw as responsible for the homicidal bureaucracy he witnessed. He writes to be heard by a system that no longer exists. He writes as an employee, not as a criminal. 7. The 3:11 a.m. routine, the ghost shift. The insistence on this time indicates that the killer does not suffer only from delusion. He suffers from pathological routinization. His brain does not register 2025 or 2024 or 2000. He lives frozen in the time when he performed the night verification. That shift was for him a symbol of duty and also of suffering. A time when he witnessed the worst abuses, saw poorly documented deaths, saw forgotten patients. It is the hour his mind remained trapped in, the exact minute his identity fragmented. The instant that defines everything he still believes himself to be. 8. Profile conclusion. What drives the killer? After consolidating all data, MINDTRACE defined the complete psychological profile. The killer is a former St. Leopold employee, likely an archivist and nurse, with schizoaffective disorder, institutional traumatic memory, and identity fusion with his function. He believes that he is still working. Dead patients were never formally closed. Old files require correction. Invisible people may serve as administrative substitutes. The institution never released him. He has the moral and bureaucratic obligation to complete pending tasks. Death is a technical closure procedure. For the team, the conclusion was clear and disturbing. He doesn't kill, he files. He doesn't choose. He fills. He doesn't flee. He works his shift. And he will only stop when he believes he has completed every file, or when someone forcibly, symbolically removes him from the hospital he still believes he belongs to. Part 6. When the MINDTRACE Division moved into the hypothesis validation phase, something unexpected began to occur. The case, which until then had followed an internally consistent logic, however psychotic, began presenting noise, oddities, superficial contradictions that, when analyzed deeply, revealed entire paths leading to wrong conclusions. It was as if the building itself were producing illusions, not supernatural illusions, but cognitive ones, scattered traces, fragments of past and present mixed together, vestiges that mimicked intentions the killer never had. And this is the point where investigations at MINDTRACE's level truly stand apart, where everything seems to make sense, but nothing actually fits. During a detailed inspection, the team discovered an entire wing that apparently did not follow the ritualistic pattern established by the killer. In Corridor 2C, there were extensive dragging marks, as if a stretcher had been repeatedly pushed back and forth without clear purpose. In addition, remnants of red paint appeared on the baseboard in small, irregular drops, something completely incompatible with the killer's meticulous care. The pattern was fragmented, chaotic, almost childish. The local police interpreted it as an attempt by the killer to mislead authorities. But MINDTRACE realized something different. The handwriting of the drops was not his. The paint was identical, but the gesture wasn't. There was no symbolic intent, no phrase, no structure. For Liz, this wasn't the killer's doing. It was the consequence of thermal infiltration. The paint had leaked from an old corroded can behind the wall, loosened by vibrations from flashlights and the team's movement. An environmental false clue, but perfectly capable of derailing a less trained investigation. The team found recent footprints in the north wing, light marks, as if someone wearing heavy boots had walked there before the police. The first reading suggested the killer had moved into an area that previously wasn't part of his ritual. But there was one detail. The footprints were too symmetrical. Jay examined them closely. The distance between each step was identical, exactly 72 centimeters. No variation, no deviation, no weight shift, no lateral drag. It was as if a machine had left the pattern. And that's when he realized they weren't human footprints. They were marks left by old thermal storage boxes dragged by staff during the hospital's closure decades earlier. Each box had a metal support underneath that created marks very similar to footprints. The fine accumulated dust had preserved a historical impression that now looked recent. Another fragment of the past trying to imitate the present. The external cameras recorded on 2 different nights, duplicated shadows crossing the same window point. Police concluded prematurely that there were 2 killers. But when MINDTRACE analyzed frame by frame, a detail emerged. The secondary shadow lagged behind the primary by fractions of milliseconds. This could indicate an accomplice walking directly behind or duplication from irregular double-layered glass. When examining the window in person, Mark found the answer. The glass had 2 overlapping layers with an internal air bubble caused by an old impact. The result was an internal mirroring. The second shadow came from the killer himself. It was just a reflection projected through imperfections in the pane. The accomplice hypothesis dissolved immediately. One of the most suspicious findings appeared when the team found the old electric generator partially triggered. Wires were displaced, the main switch was crooked, and traces of recent heat were detected. It appeared as though the killer had tried to restore power to the hospital, something that would amplify the symbolic scope of his delusion by returning mechanical life to the building. But Liz noticed something odd. There was no coherence between the complexity of the crimes and the lack of technique in handling the generator. The killer demonstrated meticulous skill with old objects, especially medical equipment. But electricity? Nothing in his behavioral signature indicated any knowledge of engineering or infrastructure. When Jay examined it further, he found the origin. The wires had been partially chewed through by animals, rats most likely, and the detected heat came from accidental short circuits, not human manipulation. Another natural false clue imitating criminal intent. The most dangerous misdirection came when the police found a note under one of the stretchers, written on yellowed paper. "They forced me to continue." The handwriting seemed irregular, emotional, desperate, the opposite of the ritualistic, bureaucratic tone the killer had shown so far. The first impression was devastating. It looked like an indirect confession, suggesting he acted under coercion, that other figures were involved in the symbolic reactivation of the hospital. But the paper contained a silent truth. The fiber type didn't match paper used at St. Leopold. It was contemporary recycled paper, with markings only found in post-2000 production. It would have been impossible for someone from the old era to have written it. And more importantly, the ink wasn't the same as the one used on the walls. The note had been left recently, but by whom? The answer came through digital analysis. It was a draft left by a local police officer, jotting down a theoretical hypothesis during the first hours of the building's lockdown. He had lost the note inside the environment. A mistaken conclusion based on it could have created an entire false narrative. Accomplices, higher orders, a hospital conspiracy. MINDTRACE discarded it instantly. The team found 3 rooms sealed from the inside with wood nailed across the doors. It looked like the killer was trying to hide something. Perhaps bodies, perhaps records. But when Mark examined the wood, he realized the nails were far older than the recent crimes. The rooms had been closed off in the 1970s after a chemical incident, and the killer, in his psychosis, had never touched them. To him, these gaps simply didn't exist. They were unregistered areas, sections of the hospital that didn't belong to his shift. For the team, this revealed something crucial. The killer operates only within the cognitive boundaries of the role he once held. He does not enter areas that were not his original responsibility, and this would drastically reduce the search perimeter going forward. To any other team, St. Leopold would have generated false conclusions, distorted narratives, and non-existent suspects. But for MINDTRACE, one thing became clear. The killer doesn't leave false clues. The building does. History does. The past does. His mind is precise. It's the world around him that's fragmented. Part 7. MINDTRACE had removed the distractions, filtered the noise, separated what belonged to the environment from what was true behavioral signature. Now, the hospital would finally reveal what it had always kept. Not a dark secret, but a structural truth. A piece of the past that explained not only the crime, but the entire delusion guiding every step of the killer. The discovery came from something unexpected. A file that shouldn't exist. While Mark was reviewing the material spread across the circular archive, he noticed a folder that stood out from all the others. The color was slightly different, less yellowed, yet more worn. The paper looked as though it had been handled countless times over the years, as if someone had opened and closed it obsessively. But what drew attention wasn't the appearance. It was the label. The name was erased. The label wasn't illegible from time, it had been scraped off. Someone had removed the patient's identity, scratching the name with enough force to break the surface of the folder while keeping everything else intact. A detail like that is never accidental. When the team opened the folder, they found what looked like a normal clinical record, except for one disturbing detail. Each page contained deliberate gaps. Entire lines were covered with old correction fluid, rough blotches of smeared ink, observations manually censored. And yet, at the end of the folder, one signature appeared repeated dozens of times, as if someone had obsessively practiced the handwriting. Night shift supervisor, AM. No employee with those initials appeared in official records. For the police, this would mean nothing. For MINDTRACE, it meant everything. Dr. Liz examined the folder with absolute focus. She noticed that the notes, though appearing clinical, were not descriptions of a patient. They were descriptions of functions. The censored lines, when viewed under oblique light, revealed words typical of internal staff evaluations, not fit for autonomy. Emotional instability tied to environment, requires constant supervision, inability to detach from institution. These terms were not used for psychiatric patients. They were used to evaluate employees under administrative observation. The conclusion emerged instantly. The scratched-out record was the killer's file, a staff file, not a patient's. And someone in the past had tried to hide it. Jay found a number repeated across several pages, 4B77, a sequence that seemed irrelevant. But when he compared it to the hospital's old floor plans, he realized the code corresponded to a specific location, the central supply room in the nursing wing, a space supposedly without clinical function, but used as an employee rest area during long shifts. Later internal records showed that in 1977, this location was the site of a serious incident, an internal report of psychological abuse by doctors against employees considered emotionally fragile. The case was never formally investigated. The hospital was on the verge of shutting down and buried the incident. MINDTRACE cross-checked the data, AM, the initials repeated in the file, year of reference, 1977, location, 4B, the pattern closed. The killer was an employee assessed as emotionally unstable who had suffered psychological abuse inside the hospital. The hospital didn't just traumatize him. He was a direct victim of the institutional negligence he was now trying to correct. Mark noticed that the phrase had appeared not only on the current walls but was also written, in the same handwriting, on the final pages of the scratched-out record. But there was more. On the back of the final page, almost imperceptible, another phrase appeared, written so many times that the paper seemed to breathe beneath the ink. I am forgotten among files. This phrase was revealing. It wasn't a recent delusion. It was an old memory. It was the voice of someone who, even while alive, had been treated like a misplaced document. The hospital hadn't just neglected him. He had been administratively erased, identity dissolved, function diluted, existence recorded as failure. His later psychosis hadn't come from nowhere. It came from this. With the code 4B77 in hand, MINDTRACE searched for the room. It didn't appear on any modern floor plan, but it was there, behind a warped wooden panel where corroded metal showed decades of disuse. When the team opened the space, they found a room frozen in time. At the center of the room, still intact, was a cabinet with folders organized by color, each containing daily task records for employees, timings, checklists, internal notes. But only one folder had been left open, as if someone returned to it often. Inside it, a sheet dated 1978 read, Employee AM removed from duty due to emotional collapse during shift. Irregular documentation maintenance. It was the first time the full name appeared, Arthur Morrow. And next to the report, a final line, written later in different ink, Return not authorized. That document, that final sentence, that record forgotten like dust. It was the trigger. It was the exact moment Arthur stopped being an employee and became the administrative ghost of the hospital. St. Leopold never discharged him because it never formalized his departure. He was erased, not released. Crossed out, not freed. Filed, not concluded. MINDTRACE reached the conclusion. The killer is not reliving the past. He is trying to correct his own file. Every death, every wristband, every ritual is an attempt to resolve his record. The record that was never closed. Arthur Morrow kills to imitate the closure process he never received. The victims represent himself. The wristbands represent his erasure. The phrases represent his accusation. The schedules represent his eternal shift. The entire hospital represents his broken mind. And the most frightening part, he believes he will only be free once he finalizes all pending cases, including his own. The next step wouldn't just be finding Arthur. It would be finding him before he decided his own record needed to be closed as well. Which meant Arthur was about to die, or kill again, or both. The race against time had begun. Part 8. Night fell over Buffalo with the same density as the memories accumulated in the walls of St. Leopold. The wind seeped through broken windows, carrying particles of paint, dust, and memories that seemed to move like an ancient organism awakening in silence. It was the first night since the discovery of Arthur Morrow's file, and it would also be the last dawn in which he continued his ghost shift without direct opposition. MINDTRACE did not enter the hospital as police, nor as hunters. They entered as those stepping into a mind on the verge of collapse, with care, precision, and awareness of the fragility of everything inside. The building was almost completely dark, except for a faint glow coming from the third floor, exactly at 3:11 a.m. The hour that hadn't changed in 40 years, the hour that served as compass and prison for Arthur. Liz Murray took the lead. She understood that the confrontation would not be physical. It would be psychological, symbolic, almost therapeutic. Arthur wouldn't react to footsteps, but to the sound of institutional authority. If the team misjudged their tone, they could trigger a lethal episode, not out of violence, but out of ritual self-destruction. As they climbed the stairs, they saw what looked like a carefully prepared corridor, aligned stretchers, stacked files, clean, organized wristbands. It was Arthur's mind office projected into physical space. It was where he rebuilt the past. And at the end of the corridor, they saw the silhouette. A thin, hunched man with a tired posture, holding a yellowed clipboard. He didn't seem aware that he was being observed. He reviewed a name written on an old wristband, murmuring inaudible words. He performed the action like nurses performing routine checks, the same gesture decades later, as if nothing had changed. Jay recognized the movement. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't defensive. It was functional. Arthur was on duty. MINDTRACE's approach could not rely on intimidation. Any attempt at direct control would activate his institutional trauma. They needed to break the ritual cycle without dismantling his identity. Liz took 2 steps without haste, without an ounce of threat. She stopped at the exact interaction distance, not too close, not too far. Arthur lifted his head. He didn't show fear. He didn't run. He didn't attack. He merely paused like someone interrupted in the middle of an important task. He looked at Liz with disorganized but not hostile eyes. There was exhaustion. There was weariness. There was the expression of someone trying to fulfill obligations that had been destroying him for decades. And he said, not with voice, but with posture, "I'm on shift." There were no words, just gestures. The hand resting on the clipboard, the slightly inclined body, the stiff neck, the short breath. Everything about him said it. Liz didn't reply with everyday language. She replied with institutional posture, not commanding, but acknowledging. She tilted her head slightly, like someone receiving a report. And that was enough for Arthur to understand that someone superior was present. Not superior in coercive hierarchy, but in the administrative hierarchy recognized by his delusion. Tension settled right there. Not because there was physical danger, but because Arthur Morrow's fate depended on a subtle detail. If he believed his supervisor was there to evaluate him, he might attempt to finish what remained, including his own file, ending his life with some fatal symbolic gesture. The team had to prevent that. Mark Henderson took the next step. He held a folder, the scratched-out file found in the archive. That document was the key. He didn't show it immediately. He simply let the folder remain visible. No direct offering, no abrupt gesture. Arthur saw it. and froze. The reaction wasn't anger, it was internal collapse. He stepped back once, then again. His eyes welled with tears, not sentimental emotion but the sudden awareness that his existence, his file, was exposed. Jay murmured quietly, the observation the team silently shared. He's not afraid of punishment. He's afraid of audit. It was true. For Arthur, being seen wasn't the issue. Being reviewed was. Liz stepped forward gently, holding the folder at a neutral height. Not as an accusation, but as a technical item. Arthur tried to approach, but his hands trembled. It wasn't fear of her. It was fear of the content. His voice finally emerged, low, fragmented as if coming from a throat exhausted by decades of silence. I was forgotten in the file. I never got discharged. They didn't close my case. Each word was not a confession of crime, but a confession of administrative pain. Liz understood he wasn't fighting against the hospital. He was fighting to leave it. And then she made the only gesture capable of breaking the cycle. She closed the folder. Deliberately, slowly, with clear intention. The sound of the paper meeting the cover resonated like a formal closure, like an invisible stamp. And Arthur reacted as if that gesture had finally completed his interrupted existence. His breathing changed. His body lost rigidity. His gaze, once frozen in the past, wavered as if seeing the present for the first time. But his mind, upon perceiving the symbolic closure, entered the most critical moment of psychosis, the instant of disintegration. Arthur turned and ran, not to escape the team but to complete the final ritual suicide, at the place where he believed his original file had been created. Corridor 4B77, the room that erased him. The exact point where he stopped existing as a person. The team chased after him, not with weapons, not with force. They needed to stop Arthur from finalizing his own discharge. He entered the room, fell to his knees, placed his hand on the old marks on the wall, and whispered, "File completed." MINDTRACE arrived in time. Liz knelt beside him, maintaining respectful distance, and did what he had never received in life: an emotional closure. She placed the closed folder on the floor within his line of sight and said, with firm, institutional but human tone, "Arthur, your shift is over. The file is closed. You may stand up." He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He simply breathed, like someone who had waited 40 years to hear exactly that. Part 9. Room 4B77, in the oldest wing of St. Leopold, seemed to breathe like an organism awakening from a deep coma. The walls had the texture of decades of forgetting. The heavy air carried dust that moved like suspended particles of memory. It was there that Arthur Morrow had been erased. And it was there that he would now have to be rescued from his own mind. MINDTRACE knew that the most dangerous moment wasn't the initial confrontation, but the moment after the collapse of the delusion. When the core belief sustaining a person's identity for decades breaks, the mind searches desperately for a route of reorganization. That route could become escape, an episode, or symbolic self-destruction. Arthur was exactly at that point. He remained kneeling, eyes fixed on nothing, as if trying to comprehend an entire life that had suddenly stopped making sense. The closed folder, his completed file, rested just inches from his hand. It should have brought relief. But to someone whose identity was sustained by function, the end of the shift could feel like the end of himself. Liz Murray observed every micro-gesture, the short breath, the barely perceptible tremor in his hands, his fixation on the floor. He didn't look at the agents, didn't try to run, and didn't show aggression. But that didn't mean safety. It meant deep disorientation. Jay Carter cognitively assessed Arthur's state. He was in post-delusional dissociation, a fragile condition where identity restructures in seconds, capable of generating unpredictable impulses. Jay murmured, almost like a clinical note, "He's between two worlds. The capture needs to be symbolic, not physical." If they used force, Arthur would interpret it as institutional punishment. If they tried reasoning, he would become lost in the language. They needed to capture him inside the universe his mind recognized. Mark Henderson took the first step. He knew nothing there should induce a sense of coercion. The capture had to seem to Arthur like an administrative transfer, not a detention. He slowly removed from his pocket a neutral hospital wristband without names, without dates, an empty administrative object, a symbol of admission, but without function. He placed it within view, not offering it, not approaching. Instantly, Arthur reacted, his gaze fixed on the object, not with fear, but with recognition. For someone who lived 40 years in an eternal shift, the wristband did not represent imprisonment, but process. And process was understandable. Process was safe. Process was the only language his mind still knew how to decode. Liz continued. She opened a small space between each word with intentional rhythm. Arthur, we need to record your discharge. The word discharge triggered an immediate response. Arthur murmured without raising his head. I haven't been cleared yet. Liz maintained the serene firmness the case required. That is what we're here to do. Arthur's fragmented mind caught something he had never heard. A formal authorization, an external validation, a rite of passage he had waited 4 decades for. The capture began there, without handcuffs, without touch, without imposition. The capture began with a sentence that worked like an emotional stamp. But a dissolving mind doesn't always accept closure easily. When Liz slowly brought the wristband closer, not to put it on him, but to keep it visible, Arthur reacted with sudden internal intensity. He rose abruptly, not to fight, but as someone who believes he must complete one more task before being released. He ran into the corridor. The sound of his footsteps echoed as if each impact awakened old memories. He headed toward the south wing, precisely where the old isolation rooms were located. Jay understood immediately what that meant. Arthur believed he had to complete his own admission before accepting discharge. Meaning, he wanted to place himself on the stretcher where he once believed he had been registered as unstable. If he reached that room, he might attempt to finalize the death ritual as the finalization of his own file. The capture became a race against symbolism. MINDTRACE ran after him, but strategically. This was not police pursuit. It was cognitive intervention. Mark accelerated past Arthur and positioned himself at the entrance of the isolation wing. He didn't block it with force. That would be seen as containment. He simply stood there like a human file blocking an invalid category. Liz approached with slow steps. She didn't shout. She didn't call. She pronounced with surgical precision, Arthur, this wing is no longer in the system. It no longer belongs to your records. The phrase hit him like symbolic electric shock. He stopped, froze. His breathing shifted sharply. For a mind that operates through categories, areas that do not belong to the system cease to exist as destinations. They become cognitively inaccessible zones. Arthur stepped back twice, disoriented. He searched for a new procedure to fulfill, but found none. Finally, his posture collapsed. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until seated on the floor, defeated, not by the team but by the realization that there were no more tasks left to complete. It was the ideal moment for symbolic capture. Liz knelt again, keeping Arthur in her field of vision, symmetrical, respecting his mental space. The neutral wristband was in her hand. It did not represent imprisonment. It represented process. With a slow gesture, she placed the wristband on the floor next to his hand without touching him, and declared in the exact tone of institutional closure, Arthur Morrow, record finalized. You are officially discharged. The sentence was the cognitive equivalent of a signature. Arthur looked at the wristband, touched it with 2 fingers, as if touching his own rewritten history. And for the first time, his shoulders relaxed. He raised his hands, not in surrender, but in acceptance. Jay approached and applied light clinical padded restraints, hospital transport straps, not handcuffs, used for safe patient transfer during crises. Arthur did not resist. On the contrary, he positioned his arm voluntarily. It was the gesture of someone who finally understood his shift had ended. The team descended the stairs in silence. Arthur walked between them, without screams, without violence, without agitation. With each floor left behind, it was as if pieces of the hospital, pieces of his frozen identity fell away. The outside light entered through the main door like a symbol of transition. For a man who had been mentally trapped in a night shift for 40 years, stepping through the exit of the building was, in itself, the true capture. Not by the agents, but by time. When Arthur crossed the door, St. Leopold stayed behind, finally without a worker trapped in administrative eternity. Part 10. There are places that never stop existing, even after they've closed. Not because they still have walls, corridors, or forgotten files, but because a mind carries them forever. The St. Leopold Psychiatric Institute was not just an abandoned building. It was the fragment of an era. It was the echo of a system that treated human suffering as an administrative procedure. It was a file that never closed. Arthur Morrow was never a killer driven by violence. He was an employee whose identity was shaped, broken, and archived by an institution that trained him to obey, but never taught him how to exist outside its walls. When the hospital closed, Arthur didn't receive a farewell. He received a documentary void. No discharge record, no release, no closure. And for someone who learned to live by protocol, nothing is more devastating than a story without an ending. The deaths he caused did not seek revenge, power, or recognition. They were desperate attempts to correct what he believed were old failures. The bodies were files, the wristbands, labels, the stretchers, indexed pages. The entire hospital was his consciousness in looping motion, reconstructing a shift that never ended. In the end, his mind wasn't chasing people. It was chasing unfinished processes. It was trying to reorganize the past in order to survive the present. The MINDTRACE Division understood that to save Arthur, physically capturing him wouldn't be enough. He needed to be captured symbolically, given the only key capable of freeing him: formal closure. A simple gesture, yet unattainable for 4 decades. The closed folder, the neutral wristband, the final phrase spoken with calm institutional tone: "Your shift is over." And in that moment, Arthur was finally able to leave the hospital, not as a fugitive, not as a prisoner, but as someone who, for the first time, received authorization to move forward. St. Leopold remains even today wrapped in silence, yellow tape, and an air of abandonment that seems to watch whoever passes by. But now, there are no longer shadows crossing its windows at 3:11 a.m. The eternal shift has been interrupted. The file has been closed. The case reminds us that many times the most disturbing crimes do not arise from human malice, but from the collapse of structures meant to protect, from institutions that break people without realizing it. Arthur Morrow did not seek to kill. He sought to be seen, to be recorded, to be completed. In the end, we realize that what defines a human being is not who they are inside an institution, but who they become once they are finally allowed to leave it. And some wait a lifetime for that permission.